Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 2019 BASF webinar on herbicide resistance management. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Sean Haney, founder of realagriculture.com and host of Real Ag Radio that you can hear every day at 4:30 Eastern on Rural Radio 147. I'm going to be your moderator today. For those of you that have been to these webinars before, welcome back. And for the first timers, well, you're in for a treat. We got lots of great information today. We're going to hear from three industry-leading experts as they discuss the most recent trends in herbicide resistance, the biggest problem weeds, as well as effective management strategies. We're going to hear from Peter Sikkema. He's a professor in field crop weed management with the University of Guelph. Eric Johnson is a weed scientist and research officer with the University of Saskatchewan. And finally, Andrew Reed. He's the technical service specialist with BASF Canada. As you can see, we have lots of great perspectives to cover in today's webinar, so let's get started and get rolling here. So, with the increase of herbicide resistance across Canada, today's webinar is a chance to catch up on the latest concerns. Our three Canadian experts are here to give us the big picture perspective on problem weeds and relevant management strategies in both Eastern and Western Canada. It's truly a national perspective. More specifically, our experts will cover topics such as the cause and economic impact of herbicide resistance. They'll also discuss strategies to effectively manage the problem. Strategies that include crop rotation, the use of multiple modes of action, proper cultural practices, and herbicide layering. And they'll also look at managing herbicide resistance for the long term, because just doing things in the short term, not necessarily great for your bottom line. We'd like to end the webinar today with your chance to answer or to ask questions. To submit a question, just type it in the chat box, and we'll have one of our resistant management experts answer them during the Q&A period. So all three of our panelists will participate in the Q&A. It's always one of the highlights of all these webinars. Also, for those of you that are certified crop advisors, you'll receive one CCA CEU credit for attending this webinar. Just make sure you entered your CCA number when you signed in. If you registered at an earlier date and forgot to do it, well, no problem. Just be sure to contact the Ag Solutions Customer Care Center. Before we dive into the discussion with our experts, let's take a little bit of a deeper look at today's topic because it truly is important. When it comes to countries with the highest number of herbicide-resistant weeds, actually Canada ranks third only behind Australia and the United States. In fact, Canadian populations of herbicide-resistant weeds have increased rapidly over the last 30 years. The number of problem weeds is approximately 77, with one species reported in British Columbia, 24 in Alberta, 22 in Saskatchewan, 30 in Manitoba, and 38 in Ontario. That's why it's crucial to be aware of the risks of herbicide resistance and to make management decisions that help you stay ahead of the issue. Be proactive, not reactive. Our first speaker is Peter Sikkema. He'll be sharing some insight on herbicide resistance and its spread across Canada. Peter has been a faculty member at the University of Guelph, Ridgetown campus for 30 years. And he brings extensive experience with glyphosate-resistant weeds in Ontario through his research on weed management in corn, soybeans, cereals, and dry beans. I'll pass things over to Peter. Peter, you're up. Go for it.
Well, good morning, everyone. In my presentation this morning, I plan to give a very brief overview of herbicide-resistant weeds in Canada. And then I'll specifically look at herbicide-resistant water hemp in the province of Ontario. Then I'll address the question, why did this problem develop? And then I'll look at potential corn and soybean yield and monetary losses due to glyphosate-resistant weeds. And finally, I'll finish my presentation with, what should farmers do? So this slide just summarizes the number of weed biotypes that have evolved resistance to the various herbicide groups across Canada. You can see the herbicide groups listed in the left-hand column, and then the provinces across the top, and then the total number of weed biotypes that have evolved resistance to a specific mode of action on the right-hand side. So if we look at group 1 herbicides, there are 3 resistant biotypes in the province of Alberta. They are wild oats, green foxtail, and Persian darnel. It's the same 3 species in Saskatchewan. In Manitoba, it's wild oats and green foxtail. And there's 1 species that has evolved resistance to the group 1 herbicides in Ontario, and that is large crabgrass. So if you look at the column on the right, you'll see that there are 4 different weed species that have evolved resistance to the group 1 herbicides. The herbicide group where there are the most weed biotypes that have evolved resistance are the group 2 herbicides, and there are 23 different weed species that have evolved resistance to the group 2 herbicides. You will notice that the next group that has the largest number of weed species that have evolved resistance are to the group 5 herbicides. And interesting to me, now the group with the third most weed biotypes that have evolved resistance are to the group 9 herbicides, or glyphosate or Roundup. At the bottom, you will notice that there are 30 weed species that have evolved resistance to herbicides in the province of Ontario, followed by 24 in Alberta, 19 in Manitoba, and 17 in Saskatchewan. But what makes this challenge even greater for producers is that we now have weed biotypes that have evolved resistance to 2, 3, 4, or 5 different herbicide modes of action. There are 10 weed biotypes across Canada that have evolved resistance to 2 distinct mode of actions. There's 3 weed species that have evolved resistance to 3 modes of action. And there are now 2 weed species that have evolved resistance to 4 different modes of action. And there's 1 weed species in Manitoba, it's wild oats, that has evolved resistance to the group 1, 2, 8, 14, and 15 herbicides. So now I'm going to focus specifically on herbicide-resistant water hemp in the province of Ontario. This is a picture of one of our field sites. It's actually on Walpole Island. We've rented all of this land from the producer. And on the left-hand side is a series of experiments where we're looking at the control in soybean. And on the right-hand side is we have a series of experiments where we're looking at control in corn. So just to give you a history of glyphosate-resistant water hemp in the province of Ontario, in 2014, poor control of water hemp was reported in a field in Lambton County. If you look at the picture in the lower right-hand side, that is a commercial soybean field in Lambton County in 2014, and that's the density that some farmers in Ontario deal with in terms of this weed biotype. So the first question we wanted to address is this biotype resistant to glyphosate or Roundup? And you will see the 2 pots on the left-hand side with numbers 25 and 27. They were sensitive to glyphosate. And then notice the 2 pots on the right-hand side, fields 21 and 46. They were sprayed with glyphosate at the field rate of 0.67 liters per acre. And they are obviously resistant to glyphosate. And that was the first time we documented glyphosate-resistant water hemp in the province of Ontario. So we now know that glyphosate-resistant water hemp occurs in the 4 southwestern counties in Ontario. So it occurs in Essex, Kent, Lambton, as well as Middlesex County. The next question we wanted to address was, is this biotype resistant to other modes of action? And you can see that this is field number 22. The G stands for glyphosate on the left-hand side of the screen. And then the A is for atrazine and the I is for imazethapyr. And this biotype is resistant to group 9, group 5, and group 2 herbicides. So really interesting, this is a farmer's field near Cottam, Ontario, and you will see that atrazine did not control this resistant biotype of water hemp, and right beside it we have another group 5 herbicide, metribuzin, and it did control that biotype. So the question is, why does atrazine not work, and why does metribuzin still provide effective control? And I put the chemical structure of atrazine and metribuzin on the slide, and then I put a red box around the chlorine on the atrazine molecule and the oxygen on the metribuzin molecule. This biotype of water hemp has enhanced levels of an enzyme. It's called glutathione S-transferase, and the chlorine molecule on the atrazine chemical structure provides a binding site for that enzyme. It breaks down the herbicide into a non-phytotoxic metabolite, and you have a resistant biotype. Really interesting, even though metribuzin has the exact same mode of action as atrazine, its chemical structure is different. It doesn't have a chlorine at the number 1 position. It doesn't provide a binding site for the enzyme, and the herbicide is still effective. So the next question we wanted to address in our research, we found from previous research that these biotypes were resistant to the group 2 herbicide pursuit or the imidazolone herbicides. And the question we wanted to address, is it also resistant to other herbicide families within the group 2 herbicides? And you will see that this biotype is also resistant to the sulfonylurea classic and the triazolopyrimidine herbicide first rate. So resistance to the group 2 or ALS inhibiting herbicides is conferred by an amino acid substitution on the ALS gene. And so if you have a serine to threonine substitution at position 653 of the ALS enzyme, that amino acid substitution will confer resistance to the imidazolone herbicide pursuit, which is represented by an R in the first line there. But notice that it does not confer resistance to the sulfonylurea herbicide classic or the triazolopyrimidine first rate. In contrast to that, if you're the unlucky farmer and you have a tryptophan to leucine amino acid substitution at position 574 of the ALS enzyme, that amino acid substitution confers resistance to all 3 group 2 herbicide families, the sulfonylureas, the imidazolones, and the triazolopyrimidines. Really interesting, a previous graduate student of mine, Brittany Hedges, noticed in the greenhouse that some of the plants survived after application of a group 14 herbicide, Cobra. And so we looked at 6 different group 14 herbicides, Blazer, Reflex, and Cobra, which are diphenyl ethers, AIM, which is an aryl triazolinone, Aragon, which is a pyrimidine dione, and Blackhawk, which is a phenylpyrazole. And you will notice that in the seed collected in 2016 from the 7th field that Brittany collected seed at, that field had biotypes that were resistant to 4 of the 5 group 14 herbicide families used in the province of Ontario. So we screened all of the seed lots that we have here at the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus, and we now know that there is group 2, group 5, 9, and 14 resistant water hemp in 28% of the seed lots that we've collected over the past 5 years. So the question is why do we have these herbicide-resistant biotypes across Canada? And generally speaking, not all the time, the reason why we have herbicide-resistant weeds is the repeated application of herbicides with the same mode of action. So the question is what is the impact of these herbicide-resistant weeds on crop yield? So in terms of corn, you can see that common ragweed interference in corn and the studies conducted in Ontario reduced corn yield by 75%. Giant ragweed interference in corn reduced corn yield by 72%, water hemp interference 17%, and Canada fleabane interference reduced corn yield by 64%. So, assuming that the average corn yield in the province of Ontario is 165 bushels per acre, you can see that on the bottom line on the slide on the screen in front of you. And over 2014 to 2018, the average selling price for corn in the province of Ontario was $4.57 per bushel. So corn has a gross value of $752 per acre. So taking the yield loss due to weed interference, glyphosate-resistant common ragweed interference would reduce the value of corn by $564 per acre. Giant ragweed would reduce the value by $541 per acre. Water hemp $128, and glyphosate-resistant Canada fleabane interference would reduce the value of corn $481 per acre. We also looked at the yield loss in soybean due to interference from these glyphosate-resistant biotypes. So common ragweed interference reduced soybean yield 74%. It was the same for giant ragweed. Water hemp reduced soybean yield 43%, and Canada fleabane 65%. The average yield of soybean in the province of Ontario from 2014 to 2018 was 47 bushels per acre. The average selling price was $12.46 for a gross value of $586 per acre. You will see that common ragweed and giant ragweed interference reduced the value of soybeans $434 per acre, water hemp $252, and Canada fleabane $381 per acre. So based on my estimates of the number of acres that are infested with these glyphosate-resistant weeds and the monetary loss that I just went through in the previous slides, if Ontario farmers did not implement any weed management tactics to control these glyphosate-resistant weed biotypes, there would be an annual loss of greater than $287 million annually in the province of Ontario. So the question is what should farmers do? And I think most people will know what the answer is, and that is we have to introduce more diversity into our crop and weed management programs. We need diverse crop rotations, hopefully with a minimum of 3 different crops in the rotation, the use of multiple herbicide modes of action, the use of tillage at strategic points in your long-term crop rotation, the use of cover crops at strategic points in your crop rotation, decreasing crop row widths, and harvest weed seed control. I would like to just introduce you to an integrated water hemp management study that we've initiated in the province of Ontario. The goal of this study is to deplete the number of water hemp seeds in the seed bank by 95% using weed management practices that can be implemented on commercial farms in Ontario. The study length is 9 years. It was started in 2017 and it will finish in 2025. The study was implemented on 2 commercial farms in Ontario. One of them's near Cottam, Ontario, and the other is on Walpole Island. Prior to the initiation of the study, we took soil cores, grew them out in the greenhouse to determine the number of water hemp seeds in the seed bank when the study was initiated. And amazingly, at the Cottam site, there was 165 million water hemp seeds per acre in the seed bank when we started the study. And on Walpole Island, it was 16 million seeds in the seed bank. We're looking at 5 different rotations in this study. We have continuous soybeans. We have two crop rotations, either a corn soybean rotation or soybean wheat rotation. And then we have a 3 crop rotation of corn, soybean, winter wheat, which is the most common crop rotation on cash crop farms in Ontario. And the most diverse rotation we've established is corn, soybean, wheat, with a cover crop seeded after winter wheat combining. We've introduced up to 7 effective modes of action on water hemp in these rotations, and we reduced the soybean row width from 30 to 15 inches or from 75 to 37.5 centimeters. So looking at the number of modes of action. In our control, which is continuous soybean, and Roundup is the only herbicide applied, there's only one mode of action. In the continuous soybean, where we've reduced the row width from a 30-inch row to a 15-inch row, and now we've applied Fierce pre-emergence and then layered that with Roundup Extend applied post-emergence, there are 4 modes of action. In the 2-crop rotation of soybean followed by corn, Fierce is applied pre-emergence in the soybean followed by Roundup Extend post. And then in corn, Acuron was applied pre-emergence and Marksman is applied post, and there are 6 effective modes of action. In the soybean wheat rotation, you can see there are 6 effective modes of action. And in our most diverse crop rotation of corn, soybean, and wheat, you can see that there are 7 effective modes of action to reduce the number of water hemp seeds in that seed bank after 9 years. Just to show you a few pictures of this experiment, this is the Walpole Island site. In the foreground, you can see winter wheat. In the background is corn. And then just to the right of the corn is soybean seeded in 15-inch rows. And this is just another picture of the exact same site. In the foreground is soybean. In the background, you can see corn, and then to the left of the corn is the winter wheat. Here you can see the contrast between planting soybean in 30-inch rows, and the only herbicide used was Roundup, and right beside it is continuous soybean, but the difference is soybeans are planted in 15-inch rows, Fierce is applied pre-emergence, and then that's layered with Roundup Extend applied post-emergence. And here you can see the 3-crop rotation of Acuron followed by Marksman in corn, Fierce followed by Roundup Extend in soybean, and Infinity applied post-emergence in winter wheat. And here you can see the difference between a no cover crop and an oat plus oilseed radish cover crop that was planted after winter wheat combining. So this is my last slide, and in summary, what I would like to say that I think it's incumbent on all people involved in weed management to make sure that we introduce more diversity into our crop and weed management systems. We need a number of different crops in our rotation, and then we have to take advantage of cultural, biological, and mechanical weed control tactics so that we can ensure the usefulness of herbicides for the long term into the future. Thank you very much.
Hey, great thoughts there, Peter. I want to remind everybody that if you have questions for Peter or any of our presenters, stay tuned for the Q&A portion of the webinar, and you can enter your questions in the chat box. Our next presenter is Eric Johnson. So we had the Eastern Canadian flavor. Now it's time to move over to Western Canada. Eric is a research officer with the Department of Plant Sciences at the University of Saskatchewan. With 36 years of extension and research experience in chemical, cultural, and mechanical weed control, Eric brings a lot of knowledge to the table. Eric has also contributed data to approximately 130 pesticide minor use registrations. Eric, you're up.
Thank you, Sean, and good morning, everyone. Well, I want to start off by just acknowledging that most of this work that I'm talking about is part of a team that I'm involved with. So Dr. Chris Willenberg and Dr. Steve Shirtliff, they are the leaders of a lot of this research, but I also want to acknowledge the contribution of Lena Sorovi. Lena is a research officer with Dr. Shirtliff. So as Peter mentioned, he gave a very good summary in terms of the issues with herbicide resistance. And of course, one of the challenges that we have is that there's really been no new herbicides that have a novel site of action introduced for at least 20 years. So we've been relying on the same mechanisms of action for quite a while now. We've repeated applications of the same site of action on an annual basis, and this has led to resistance. And today I'm going to focus a little more on group 2 resistance, and I'll focus on pulse crops because that's where most of the work or most of the stuff that I've been working on for the last few years. Okay, so in terms of group 2 resistance, Peter had mentioned that it's the site of action that has some of the most resistance in Canada, and in Western Canada, in pulses, we've really over-relied on group 2 herbicides, and so the 3 target species that that I'll talk about today are wild mustard in lentil, kochia in lentil, and at the bottom there you'll see cleavers. Actually, that picture is in a field pea field, although you can't really find any peas in there because the cleavers have just overtaken it. However, cleavers are moving south and becoming more problematic in lentils as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about slowing the rate of resistance evolution, and I want to point out that these strategies are only effective before a weed population becomes predominantly resistant. And what we're trying to do is reduce selection pressure. So in order to do that, we have to reduce the number of herbicide applications. Peter talked about diversifying crop rotations, including things like perennial crops and winter crops, cultural practices like competitive crops, cultivar choice, fertilizer placement, increasing seeding rate is just about with any crop. We found that if you increase seeding rate, you can reduce weed competition. And we may have to start looking at integrating mechanical practices, and I'll talk a little bit about them at the end of my presentation. And over the next few slides, I'll talk about alternating mechanisms of action, either through herbicide rotations or mixtures or layering. So this slide just shows you that if you just use a single herbicide year after year, depending on the mode of action, resistance can evolve very quickly, maybe in 3 to 4 years. If you rotate those herbicides, you can actually delay resistance for a few years. But one of the best practices for delaying resistance is to tank mix those herbicides. And just to point out, though, those tank mixes, both the herbicides have to be effective on that weed in order for you to delay resistance. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little about herbicide layering because in pulse crops, of course, we don't have many options, and we don't really have a lot of options for tank mixing. In peas, we have a product like Viper, where you have imazamox and bentazone, so 2 different mechanisms of action. However, it still has some limitations because both those herbicides aren't really effective on some of the weeds that we're targeting. So one thing we've been looking at is the concept of layering, and really with layering what we're doing is we're applying soil applied herbicide to reduce the weed density. These don't necessarily work perfect, but what we're trying to do is just reduce the numbers because herbicide resistance is a numbers game. The mutations that confer resistance may be 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million, 1 in 10 million. And so if we can reduce the plant population or the weed population before we apply the post herbicide, we can perhaps slow down the rate of resistance evolution by doing this as well. And you can see in this slide, this is a faba bean. On the left, we have a pre-herbicide, in this case, you might argue that, gee, that's so clean, why would I apply a post-emergence herbicide? But there's still, I'll show you some data in a minute here, there still is some benefits in terms of following up if there's any escapes, because what we want to do is reduce as much seed production as possible. But you can see certainly the potential for selection for resistance is much greater on the plot on the right than it is on the left. But I want to caution you that herbicide layering should be viewed as another tool, not a solution. And I'll just quote Dr. Niss here from the University of Wyoming. At some point, we must stop looking to herbicides as a solution to a problem created by herbicides. So these are a tool and that you can use, and but they shouldn't be looked at as an absolute solution. Okay, so I want to show you some data here from a recent experiment that Dr. Williamberg has conducted, and we've had 5 site years, so we're getting a fair amount of data. And these are a number of pre-herbicides. This is in faba bean, but this data would also apply to field pea, because all these herbicides could be used in peas. So the pre-herbicides that we're looking at is Edge, a group 3, Heat at the high rate, which is a group 14, flumioxazin or Valtera, a group 14 as well, pyroxasulfone or Zidua, which is a group 15, Authority Supreme, which is a combination of a 14 and 15, that's sulfentrazone and peroxasulfone, and Heat Complete, which is saflufenicil, a group 14, and peroxasulfone, a group 15. Now, just to point out that the rate I'm using in this particular experiment is slightly higher than the rates that are registered by BASF. When I started this, we started this experiment, we weren't aware that BASF was working on something like this, so we didn't confer on rates. They do have a 40-acre rate, though, so I think the results would be comparable. But these are the weed densities that we get, broadleaf weed densities that we're getting just prior to the post-emergence application. So you can see all the herbicides are reducing our weed density, some as high as 70%. And of course, if we're reducing the weed density by 70%, we are reducing the selection pressure. Okay, so I'm just going to, I took a few select pre-herbicides and looked at the combinations with the posts. The slide gets pretty messy if I include everything on there. And you can see here, actually, with the post-emergence herbicides that we're using here, we're using Odyssey, which is imazamox and imazethapyr, both group 2s, and Viper, imazamox, and bentazone, which is group 2 and a 6. And we're not seeing statistical differences where we're layering. However, you will notice the trends that where we're using 3 or 4 modes of action, we are getting the lowest weed densities. Now, and if we had some group 2 resistance in there, we'd see even larger differences. But the point is what we're trying to do is 2 things here, as I mentioned, reduce the selection pressure in crop, but also reduce the overall weed biomass and the overall weed seed return. Okay, I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about alternative methods of weed control. This is a master's project by Alexander Alba, and Alex looked at weed control in lentils. So that highlighted area there, you can see the problem with the wild mustard. The plot on the left has actually not received a herbicide at all. That effective weed control was just through timely rotary hoeing, min-till rotary hoeing, and inter-row cultivation. And if you want to know a little bit more about this research, you can just go to YouTube. Alexander made a really good video explaining his results, and that site is listed at the top of the slide there. So just to conclude, I concur with a lot of what Peter said. Certainly in the future, we're going to have to look at integrating cultural practices more so. Crop rotation is key, as Peter mentioned. We have to get away from things like lentil wheat rotations and extend those rotations, higher seeding rates, fertilizer placement, things like that. Combined with chemical control, herbicides are still important, but we have to look at using multiple modes of action, whether that be through tank mixes or layering. And in the future, I think we're going to have to intervene with some mechanical. I'm not talking about going back to intensive tillage, but things like clipping weeds above the crop canopy, min-till rotary hoeing, and harvest weed seed management. I'd just like to acknowledge the funding agencies and also some other collaborators, Jessica Weber with the Western Applied Research Corporation at Scott, and Jessica Pratzler with the Northeast Agriculture Research Foundation in Melfort. So thank you for listening, and back to you, Sean.
Really, really appreciate it. Great information there. So now we've heard the Eastern Canadian perspective, Western Canada. Now it's time to turn it over to Andrew Reed. He's the Technical Service Specialist at BASF Canada. Andrew has a Bachelor of Science in Agronomy with a Master's degree in Weed Science. And in the past 3 years, he has concentrated his efforts on the agronomics surrounding crop protection products in the industry. He works with marketing and research on long-term herbicide projects and in-field technical reps to support and develop the herbicide portfolio at BASF. Andrew, your turn.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sean. So good morning, everyone. And some of what I'm going to talk through here this morning, I'm going to reiterate a few things that Peter and Eric have already gone on, but I also want to give a little bit of the BASF perspective and some of the work that we're doing to try and promote some good agronomics around managing weed resistance. So really, to touch on a few of the points that Peter and Eric have already made, really, managing resistance is always easier before it occurs in the field. Now, easier said than done. Sometimes it's not always top of mind until growers actually have it occur. But really what it comes down to is good planning, good agronomics, integration of several different techniques, so cultural, biological, chemical. But one of the things that I want to make sure that I mention is when it comes to managing resistance, before and after it happens, is cleanliness is key. If you feel or if you suspect you have a field that has a weed resistance problem, one of the things that you can do is making sure you manage the spread of that weed and make sure it doesn't go any further. I actually had to go into a field situation a few years ago where a grower had a field with a very bad resistance problem. And then we went to another field about 3 miles away where right at the approach for about 100 yards down the first pass, you could see about a 30-foot swath where there was a whole bunch of weeds that had started to pop up. And I asked him what happened there. He said, well, we actually combined that other field that was really bad with weeds last year. We combined that first, and then this was the field that we came to right after, but he didn't clean his combine. And what he had actually done is he just introduced a whole nother problem into a different field on a different section of his farm that now he had to manage through. So when it comes to resistance management, you really have to look at this from a systems approach. You have to use every tool you've got in that toolbox to effectively manage the problem. So like we said, managing it before it occurs is much easier and much more effective. But even after it occurs, you don't throw your hands up and say, well, I guess that's it. You know, I'm just going to have to walk away. You still need to manage it after it occurs. And herbicides are still an important tool to use that, but we have to make sure that we're maximizing the effectiveness of those herbicides that we are utilizing. So like Eric mentioned, tank mixing multiple modes of action and making sure that they're effective on those weeds, rotating your crops and your herbicide groups frequently. And one of the other things that I don't think we can stress enough is if you are in a resistant situation, minimizing the use of those high-risk herbicides. We know the group 1s and the group 2s, they're highly effective, but they're also the highest risk herbicides in terms of selecting for resistance. So one thing I actually want to point out is when we say multiple modes of action, and I believe Peter and Eric both alluded to this, we don't really mean multiple modes of action. We mean multiple modes of effective action. And for that to happen, we need to have at least 2 active ingredients, and preferably more, to have activity on that target weed. So we've talked a lot about group 14 herbicides. We're hearing more in Western Canada about group 15 herbicides. They're a great fit, and they do have some complementary activity on some problem weeds that we have in Western Canada. And really, utilizing multiple passes with multiple modes of effective action is part of a sound integrated pest management strategy. I'm not sure who coined this term first, but it is perfectly apt for this. Is integrated pest management involves many little hammers, utilizing all different strategies. And even if one strategy isn't perfect in terms of weed control, you've got another strategy and another strategy backing that up to make sure that you're getting overall good weed management, even in a resistance situation. And this is really the basis of what we call the Advanced Weed Control Program at BASF, is utilizing multiple passes with different modes of action to get overall improved weed control. So this is something that we at BASF, we've launched this past year, and we're really trying to promote good agronomics to manage problem weeds throughout the growing season. And we've got this on 4 key crops, so peas, lentils, corn, and soybeans. And like I said, we're really trying to incorporate pre-seed, pre-emergent, residual chemistries, and then following up with different effective in-crop applications, instead of trying to put all your eggs in one basket with your pre-seed or your in-crop to help reduce that selection pressure. So what we've got here, these are actually some pictures taken from a Knowledge Harvest event last year. This is actually Dr. Bob Blackshaw in the background, being my Vanna White, helping me out with these trays. On the left side of the screen, we have a tray that's got some cleavers, volunteer Roundup Ready canola, and some wild oats, and it was sprayed with glyphosate before weed emergence. So this is a non-residual situation. On the right-hand side, this is just with the high rate of heat sprayed over top of that tray. So you can see reduction in the weed population, especially on the volunteer canola, but you also see a reduction on the cleaver population, but unfortunately, nothing on the wild oats with heat. But really what we're trying to go forward with this advanced weed control system is trying to utilize as many different modes of action that are effective on those weeds. So on both of these trays were actually sprayed with heat complete, and while you see that there were some weeds that still came through that residual application, we've actually gone ahead and followed up with some in-crop applications. This is actually a soybean demo. So the left tray, this is actually a tank mix of Ingenia and glyphosate. So in dicamba tolerant soybeans, this would be a good option to clean up some potential kochia issues. And on the right, this is actually glyphosate tank mixed with vipers. So you're looking at 5 or 6 different modes of action depending on the tank mix options that you're looking at to really get the best weed management strategy that we've got today. Now it looks nice in trays, but we've actually done this in the field as well. So this is actually a lentil trial that we did last year. So on the left side of the field in the picture there, no residual product put down pre-seed, just glyphosate. The entire field was sprayed with Solo ADV. And you'll notice on the right-hand side where we used Heat Complete, where we got that residual product down pre-seed, you'll notice that the weed control is far superior. Now, yes, you can see some weeds in the background there. It is very difficult to control the weeds that we have, especially group 2 resistant weeds, because we've got no in-crop rescue option to take out the group 2 resistant kochia or the group 2 resistant wild mustard. But by getting that pre-seed residual down, we're reducing that selection pressure and we're really getting overall better weed control than we had even last year. So this is really what it comes down to, is what we're trying to promote with this advanced weed control program is good agronomics. Get more modes of action, more modes of effective action down on that field, pre-seed and in-crop, to really make your resistance management strategy more effective. That being said, this isn't the only thing that growers should be doing. To echo what Eric said, we can't just look at herbicides as a solution for a problem created by herbicides. And it's really incumbent on all of us. We are the chemical company that produces the herbicide, but it's also incumbent upon researchers like Eric and Peter, for retailers and agronomists who are making the recommendations, and upon growers themselves. We all have a stake in managing weed resistance. So we all have to be aware of what's going on and making sure we're doing the absolute best possible job that we can to manage this problem going forward. With that, thank you very much for your attention, and Sean, I'll pass it back to you to wrap it up.
Thank you for attending, and everybody, good luck with things drying up and getting some seed in the ground. Cheers, everybody.